The Tom Woods Show, episode 2156.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Folks, if you're like me, when you criticize the Federal Reserve, you get all these lackey-style responses. Why, the Fed has made the economy more stable. You don't want to go back to the 19th century, do you? All kinds of arguments like that. Well, you can blow those and others out of the water with my free ebook, Our Enemy, the Fed. Grab it at ourenemythefed.com. Hey, everybody, Tom Woods here. I am possibly a day late with this episode, and that's because, oh my gosh, I can't believe I have to tell you this old man stuff here. But I've actually had some pretty debilitating lower back pain. And I think, when you're a kid and you see people complaining about back pain, you think that's when you know you're over the hill. When you're complaining about back pain, when you're 20, you don't even think about that. What you mean? You can have pain in your back, you don't even realize it's a thing. But I would say about 1 week per year, I have inexplicable back pain, then it just goes away. Well, this was totally my fault in a way because I felt it coming on a bit and I thought, I should probably take it easy. And then I had a huge shipment of books to ship at the post office. And I'm going to be hiring somebody to do this for me again. I used to have somebody who did this stuff for me. I'm going to be hiring somebody to do it. Can't use stamps.com because they don't do media mail. So I have to go to the post office. And I probably had 200 packages. And I just killed myself because I had to keep bending over to pick them up out of the crate and hand them to the person. It just killed me. So when I was supposed to record this episode, the prospect of walking up the stairs just seemed daunting. So I didn't. So here I am doing it the next day. Nothing has changed, by the way. The pain is just as bad. However, the sense of obligation is what has grown since yesterday. So let's jump in. We're going to finish the 3-episode series I've done on the Federal Reserve System, and I will have links to the other episodes at tomwoods.com/2156 in case you missed any of them. But as I've been saying, you don't need to have heard the previous ones in order to appreciate this one or any of the others. They're all standalone episodes, but of course, you'll get a certain synergy if you listen to all of them. So today, I want to talk about something that we bring up on this program from time to time in passing on the assumption that everybody knows it. And they don't necessarily know it. Or if they do, they may not know it at this level of detail or with this level of understanding that I hope to convey. And here in particular, I'm talking about the business cycle. What makes the economy go up and down as it does? You can understand why some sector of the economy might go up and down because of factors unique to it. But why would the entire economy go up and down? And the Austrian School of Economics, which we boost here on the Tom Woods Show, wants to answer that question by saying that the answer has to be some factor that permeates the whole economy. If the whole economy is affected, then there must be some economy-wide phenomenon at work. Whereas if it's just like the coal industry or something like that, then you can say, all right, well, maybe they're spooked by what the White House is saying about the future of coal or something like that. But the entire economy, there must be some economy-wide phenomenon. And of course, the most obvious candidate for that would be money, because money is an economy-wide phenomenon. Money is half of every transaction. It's one side of every transaction. Money for this, money for that. So money, banking, credit, these things indeed permeate the economy. Interest rates. So maybe we should look there. And as we'll see, we have good reason to look there. Now, when we had the bad recession of 2008, Paul Krugman, the economist who writes for the New York Times, said that too many people are, quote, asking how we got into this mess rather than telling us how to get out of it, unquote. But for me and for a lot of others, that's a nonsensical thing to say because in many cases, in economics, as in other areas of life, you can't get out of a pickle unless you know how you got into that particular pickle, because those things are related to each other. So I want to lay out the Austrian theory of the business cycle for you, and I want to lay it out in a way that people who have heard of it before will still get something out of it. So we're talking about a theory that F.A. Hayek actually won the Nobel Prize for in economics in 1974. And I want to bear in mind something that he insinuated and that our friend Roger Garrison, who I think is now retired from Auburn University as a professor of economics, used to amplify, which is that in order to really understand how things go wrong economy-wide, it's important to understand how they can ever go right in the first place, because then we can really understand them going wrong. So I want to describe for you two scenarios. One of them is a scenario in which things go right. And then the second scenario will be one in which things go wrong. So here's scenario number one, in which things go right. In this scenario, the following things occur. The public saves more money. Well, that means banks now have more funds to lend, namely these saved funds that were just deposited by the public. And since they have more funds to lend, then the rate of interest they charge on loans will fall. At any given time, banks are lent out to the extent that they can be at given interest rates. So if they're going to lend further, because now they have more money in the bank, and so maybe they want to lend more of that out, if they're going to lend further, then they're going to have to offer the public some enticement, given that they're already loaned up to the extent possible. So now if they're going to lend more, they have to make it more appealing to draw in a wider range of potential people who might want to borrow. So just recapping for a minute, public saves more money. Banks now have more funds to lend. They're going to have to lend those funds at a lower rate of interest. There's a greater supply, so the quote-unquote price of it is going to fall. The interest rates will fall. So these lower interest rates have consequences. They stimulate an expansion in long-term investment projects. And those long-term investment projects are more interest rate sensitive than short-term projects. And you can see that, by the way, if I give you a simple example. I mean, if you think about, suppose you had a 30-year mortgage on your house, and then suppose you had a 2-year mortgage on your house. Well, the 30-year mortgage involves the payment of way, way more interest. I mean, first year you're paying off a 30-year mortgage, you can't believe how little principal you're paying. It's almost all interest that you're paying. Whereas if you had such a thing as a 2-year mortgage, it would be mostly principal that you're paying. So the interest rate is going to be felt much, much more heavily when for 30 darn years, most of those years are mostly interest. So the longer term the project is, the more it's sensitive to interest rates. So more money in interest payments is paid over the life of a long-term than a short-term project. So a downward move in interest rates will make long-term projects seem disproportionately attractive. Now, by the way, here's a brief definition. Austrians speak of something called the structure of production. And in that structure, lower order stages of production are those stages that are closest to finished consumer goods, so retail stores, services, and the like. Wholesale and marketing are stages of higher order than these. Mining, construction, and research and development are of still higher order, since they're very remote from the finished good that reaches the consumer. So just be aware of those terms. All right. So another side of the coin when the public increases its saving is that it's consuming less. By definition, if you save more, you're consuming less. So when people's consumption spending falls, this is when it makes the most sense for higher order stages of production to expand. So what with people's additional saving, there's relatively less demand for consumer goods, let's say toothbrushes and steak dinners and hats and whatever, and the resulting contraction of lower order stages of production will release resources for use in the higher order stages. So in other words, if people are saving more now and therefore buying fewer hats or decks of playing cards right now, then the hat and playing card industries will need fewer trucks, less gasoline, fewer employees, and so on. And so the goods and employees released by consumer goods industries like these are now available to make possible the completion of the higher order projects that the low interest rates have now made more attractive to entrepreneurs. So the contraction of the lower order stages thereby makes possible the expansion of the higher order stages. So an employee who answered the phones at the playing card factory, for example, can now get a job filing work orders for a contractor as construction, a higher order stage, increases. So in short, when interest rates are free to fluctuate, they coordinate production across time and ensure that the configuration of the production structure is sustainable. Long-term production is begun only when sufficient saved resources are available to fund it. Now, you probably understand that scenario a little bit more clearly when we look at scenario number 2, in which things go wrong. In scenario number 2, the following occurs. Government-established central banks, like the Fed in the U.S., have various means at their disposal to force interest rates lower, even without any corresponding increase in saving by the public. Now, exactly how the Fed does this, well, you can look at Bob Murphy's book, Understanding Money Mechanics, Rothbard's book, The Mystery of Banking, Rothbard's book, What Has Government Done to Our Money? This is a separate issue. But just as in the case in which public saving has increased, the lower interest rates spur expansion in high-order stages of production. So the two scenarios consist of scenario 1, the public saves more, that pushes interest rates down. Scenario 2, the central bank, the Federal Reserve, forces interest rates down. But now we're going to see that there's a difference here. There are differences when interest rates fall, not naturally, but artificially. And the difference is really a crucial one. And it guarantees that these artificially low interest rates will not yield us the smooth, happy outcome in the first scenario. So in this second scenario, people have not decreased their consumption spending. If anything, the low interest rates on loans encourage further consumption. If consumption spending is not constricted, then the lower order stages of production do not contract. And if they do not contract, they do not release resources for use in the higher order stages of production. And so consequently, the economy is inadvertently arranged in an unsustainable configuration. The public does not want this ratio of higher order to lower order production. Not enough resources exist to fund both the lower order production the public wants and the wave of higher order projects the economy has been misled into initiating. So instead of harmonious economic development, where the release of resources from the lower order stages makes resources available to the higher order ones, well, there's now a tug of war between the higher and lower order stages of production because the lower order stages are not releasing resources. So now the different stages are fighting with each other over these resources instead of some stages releasing resources for the use of other stages. So the prices of the resources employed by the lower order stages, like labor, trucking services, and so on. And these are the things the public actually wants. They want the lower order stages. The prices of those resources will be bid up as the various firms and industries in these stages compete for them. And these higher input prices, in turn, threaten the profitability of the higher order projects, which were begun without the expectation of this increase in costs. And so what all this means is that the economy-wide discoordination that reveals itself in the bust, in the recession, is not caused by the free market. To the contrary, it's intervention into the free market in the form of distortions of the structure of interest rates, which are crucial coordinating mechanisms that causes the problem. Production projects that are interest rate sensitive are given artificial and unhealthy stimulation that eventually reverses itself in losses and bankruptcies. So as the boom turns into bust, the economy tries to readjust itself into a configuration that conforms to consumer preferences. That's why it's so essential for government to stay entirely out of the adjustment process, because arbitrary government behavior can only delay this necessary and healthy process. Wages and prices need to be free to fluctuate, so labor and other resources can be swiftly shifted away from bloated bubble sectors of the economy and into sustainable sectors of the economy where consumers want them. Bailouts obstruct this process by preventing the reallocation of capital into the hands of firms that genuinely cater to consumer demand, and instead props up those firms that do not. Fiscal and monetary stimulus, so-called, far from addressing these imbalances, only perpetuate them. And now note that the problem is not a decline in consumer spending. That's the usual analysis. Why people aren't spending enough. We need the government to stimulate consumption. To the contrary, there is, if anything, too much consumer spending. It's this relatively high consumer spending that's pulling factors of production back from the higher to the lower order stages of production and making the existing pattern of resource deployment unsustainable. Stimulating consumption only makes the situation worse by squeezing the already collapsing profitability of the higher order stages. The stages, remember, that are the farthest from finished consumer goods. There is no improving on Ludwig von Mises' metaphor of the master builder. An economy stimulated by artificially low interest rates is like a master builder engaged in the task of building a house that he lacks the materials to complete. If he discovers his error right away, he can limit the damage. Maybe only a small part of the house will have to be knocked down. Maybe none of it will. Maybe it'll suffice just to alter his blueprint for the rest of the house in light of the decreased supply of building materials he now knows are available to him. But what we do not want to do in the name of helping him is to get him drunk, hoping thereby to deceive him into thinking he has more building materials than he really does. This surely does not help him. Now he may not notice the problem until he's laid his very last brick. And that puts him in a far worse situation than before. With no resources left and an unfinished house in front of him, probably the whole thing will have to be torn down. And all the materials and labor hours he expended on the project will have been squandered forever. The artificially stimulated economy is like the master builder in that it too has become too ambitious in the face of the real level of resources at its disposal. Higher order stages of production are being encouraged to expand at a time when no corresponding contraction has occurred in the lower order stages, which indeed may actually be expanding. This cannot go on forever. The story of the master builder also reveals that the real problem occurs during the boom period, not the bust. The artificial boom gives the superficial impression of prosperity. Why the master builder is employed, he's producing goods for consumer use, but it's during the boom that resources are misallocated, i.e., when the master builder squanders building materials on a house he can never complete. The bust is the moment when his errors come to light and he realizes that he must modify his activities. So likewise, the economy that as a whole appears to be prospering during a boom, and some of what occurs during the boom is indeed the generation of real wealth, is in fact engaged in a misdirection of resources. The bust or the recession, painful as it is the necessary stage whereby resources are redeployed to lines of production that satisfy real consumer demand. The classic example of trying to help by temporarily holding off a recession, thereby setting the stage for a much worse recession years down the road, the equivalent of getting a temporary benefit by getting the master builder drunk, occurred in 2001. Most people, in the months following 9/11, when it seemed as if Alan Greenspan had successfully navigated the economy through the dot-com bust at the cost of only a relatively mild recession, cheered Greenspan. Greenspan, of course, was the Fed chairman at the time. The man the New York Times identified as, quote, the infallible maestro of our financial system, unquote, had lived up to expectations. But all Greenspan's interventions had done was just to hold off the inevitable recession. And that just made the downturn of 2007 and beyond all the worse. The recession of 2001 was the only one on record in which housing starts did not decline. They actually went up. From 2000 to 2001, home prices actually increased by 8.8%. Austrian economists at the time wondered about this. James Grant, who edits the Grant's Interest Rate Observer newsletter, asked, what could explain a bull market in a non-earning asset in a non-inflationary era? And the answer, Grant believed, involved artificial credit expansion and artificially low interest rates. So people drew the false conclusion, which were amplified by the alleged experts, including some Fed economists, that the housing sector is robust through thick and thin, housing prices never fall, a house is the best investment somebody can make, all this stuff. Because Greenspan would not allow the full correction to take place, clearing out entrepreneurial errors caused by his previous fiddling with interest rates, market actors persisted in their errors for years thereafter. With the economy having continued along this unsustainable trajectory at that time, the bust that inevitably came was that much worse. This was the classic case of trying to help the master builder by getting him drunk. Yes, in the short run, he keeps humming along, working on his project, but when he discovers his project has been unsustainable, all the extra time he spent on it because he was too drunk to notice the impending problem will have been a complete waste. And the same holds for the economy. Had the adjustment come in 2001, we wouldn't have had a much more severe one in 2008. Now, Paul Krugman called for precisely this policy in 2001, forced down interest rates to encourage lending and to stimulate the economy, housing in particular. He told a German interviewer, quote, "During phases of weak growth, there are always those who say lower interest rates will not help. They overlook the fact that low interest rates act through several channels. For instance, more housing is built, which expands the building sector. You must ask the opposite question. Why in the world shouldn't you lower interest rates?" So he doesn't think interest rates actually mean anything. They're just there to be manipulated by policymakers. Here's Krugman in October 2001, quote, "Economic policy should encourage other spending to offset the temporary slump in business investment. Low interest rates, which promote spending on housing and other durable goods, are the main answer," unquote. 2 months later, he again spoke of the benefits of keeping housing strong by means of intervention in the economy. Quote, "The good news about the U.S. economy is that it fell into recession, but it didn't fall off a cliff. Most of the credit probably goes to the dogged optimism of the American consumer, but the Fed's dramatic interest rate cuts helped keep housing strong even as business investment plunged," unquote. But that turned out to be precisely the problem. By keeping housing strong, instead of allowing the economy to correct itself, the Fed encouraged people to continue along an unsustainable path, thereby making the eventual and inevitable bust all the more severe when it finally arrived. So, writing for the New York Times means never having to apologize for being wrong. If you weren't wrong, you wouldn't be writing for the New York Times in the first place. Alan Greenspan once declared his inability to discern any kind of common pattern between the various boom-bust cycles in American history. He said, "There is always something different, something that does not look like all the previous ones. There is never anything identical, and it is always a puzzlement." But in fact, there is something identical, namely artificial credit expansion. It is evident throughout all the 19th century panics, and we likewise find it in the depressions and recessions of the 20th and 21st centuries. Other features of the cycle may vary. There may be a spectacular rise in tech stocks in one case and in real estate in another, but this factor is consistently present. As George Reisman wondered in Barron's, how many more crises must we endure until we realize the common denominator is the creation of money and credit by the Fed? Wall Street bankers and speculators who try to game the system and make profits during each boom are mere bit players in these crises. By fostering the booms and triggering the busts, the real villain is the institution of central banking itself," unquote. So the Austrian theory of the business cycle strongly implies what should be done once the bust hits. Certainly all inflation of the money supply must come to an end. It was this policy which brings artificially lower interest rates in its train, namely pushing interest rates low, that caused the misdirection of resources into unsustainable lines in the first place. Further misdirection, even if we dignify it with the word stimulus, cannot repair the broken economy. Prices and wages need to be free to fluctuate in accordance with changing conditions. The price system is the outcome of trillions of buying and selling decisions by business and the public. Entrepreneurs who are trying to figure out how to combine factors of production in such a way as to produce the goods consumers want at the lowest possible cost to society must refer to it. Any interference with prices and wages during the critical time in which bust evolves into recovery will subvert and thus delay the economy's adjustment process. Only an unhampered system of prices and wages can ensure that the misallocated resources, including labor, of the boom are redirected to sectors of the economy where they conform to, rather than stand in inadvertent defiance of, consumer demand. During a boom, labor and physical resources are attracted to sectors where, it will later be discovered, they did not belong. During the housing boom, some 40% of all new jobs were in the housing sector. That could not continue. Failing firms need to be allowed to go bankrupt. The recession period is when a sustainable pattern of consumption and production is reestablished. And this pattern will not permit all firms to continue as before. bankruptcy proceedings permit new owners to take over the assets of failing firms and either conduct those firms according to a different business model, turn the assets, if possible, toward the production of different goods, or simply sell off the assets and compensate as many of the creditors as can be accommodated. The government's predation on the economy in the form of spending and taxation should be reduced. Resources are thereby released that entrepreneurs can use to realign the capital structure in light of the changed conditions the bust brought to light. This strategy was followed in the Depression of 1920 to 21, which saw unemployment shoot up to 12.4% and production decline by 17%. Wholesale prices fell by 56%. The political class today would be screaming for all manner of, quote, stimulus to reverse this death spiral. But the federal government at the time cut its budget in half from 1920 to 1922 and cut the national debt by 1/3 over the course of the 1920s. Income tax rates were lowered for all income groups throughout the decade, it's true, but these lower taxes took effect after the recovery was already in progress. The Federal Reserve, for its part, did not engage in open market operations in which the Fed purchases assets with money it creates in order to increase the amount of money in circulation. It did not do that to increase the money supply. So the economy was therefore allowed to adjust without the so-called counter-cyclical government policies that we're told are essential. Signs of recovery were evident by the late summer of 1921, which is when the National Bureau of Economic Research says the Depression ended. Joseph Schumpeter, one of the eminent economists of the 20th century, contended that the 1920 to 21 case, quote, shows better than any theory could how the system pulls itself out of troughs under its own steam. William Graham Sumner said in 1896, no scheme which has ever been devised has ever made a collapsed boom go up again. Nothing in the historical record since then has altered that verdict. So, after these 3 episodes on this subject, our conclusion, end the Fed. You knew that was coming. So if you like and appreciate these episodes and The Tom Woods Show, then please do join me, help make the show possible by becoming a supporting listener at supportinglisteners.com. You get more benefits, I would venture to suggest, than from any other podcaster in libertarianism or probably also in conservatism, maybe in the world. I don't know if I dare say that, but it's a lot. So go check out all the goodies that I have waiting for you as I welcome you into my inner circle, the Tom Woods Show Elite, over at supportinglisteners.com. Thanks for listening.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit TomWoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.